Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Inside Scoop. Sharon here today, subbing in for Sue, and I'm happy to be here with Dr. Sam Goldstein, PhD, who's a pediatric neuropsychologist, the author of many articles and books, and the co-author with Harvard Medical School professor Bob Brooks of a new book called Tenacity in Children, Nurturing the Seven Instincts for Lifetime Success. And that is one of many books you've written together. And I have gotten a chance to see a sneak preview of the book. When is it coming out, Sam?
The book's been out now for about 6 weeks.
Oh, dear. Well, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I got a preview copy and I felt very special, but now I'm going to go. So it's available to purchase wherever.
It's available from all booksellers.
Okay.
People want to learn more about the book. We have a website, tenacityin.children.com.
Okay. Let's start off by chatting about your general approach. From reading your book and some of your other materials, it seems that you take a really positive approach to raising teenagers and all children. Sometimes when we talk about children and maybe taking them to a psychologist or getting help, our natural concern is what's wrong. Tell us about the approach that you take instead of what's wrong.
Well, quickly as a foundation, I was a scientist by training until I decided I liked children better than rats. And 45 years ago, I transitioned to working with people. But I took with me what I learned in terms of a scientific method. And so I try and separate science from non-science from nonsense, not make things up as we go, because in this field of education and mental health for children and teens, there are a lot of opinions sometimes short of science. We see the debate now about children wearing masks, for example. Is there science? Isn't there science? It's sometimes hard to figure that out. But the research following children growing up demonstrates that's what is right about you as a person. Your intellect, your personality, your behavior, your emotions, those are much better predictors of what will happen to you in life than what is wrong or challenging. That's part one. And part two is the more challenges or liabilities a youth may have, the more important those strengths become in guiding that person to a happy, functional, successful life. So when I work with children and families, and this is a clinic here in Salt Lake City, we see 500 or 600 children a year and teens. They have brain injuries, other genetic disorders. I sometimes talk about them as Job's children. I did a TED talk about that. The first question I ask parents is, tell me what you like about your child, what their strengths are, what's right. And once you get parents focused that way, you have a much better foundation upon which to appreciate their challenges. So our view is that what's right about you needs to be nurtured and developed, and what's wrong with you, meaning your challenges, need to be managed. Whether it's academics or emotions or behavior, we're not going to fix. The idea from many years ago, the medical model, as you put it, that we find what's wrong and fix it, really doesn't work very well in child development.
So can you give us a summary of what these seven instincts are that all children are born with that we can help to nurture?
Sure. And so listeners understand the term tenacity means grit or perseverance. It in and of itself is not an instinct. It's the term we used as an umbrella. And this is the third in a series of books. This is our 14th book. The first series of books worked on or talked about resilience, the ability to function well under adversity. What is a resilient mindset? How do parents foster that? What do we know about that in terms of outcome in adulthood? Parents come to us because they're concerned not so much about the present, but how the present may affect the future. And the new normal for teens is trying to understand and appreciate, in light of the dramatic increase in mental health and physical problems among teens in the last 7 decades, to understand what is it going to take to help them transition successfully. The second series of books dealt with self-discipline, having the self-control and the mindset to do what you know. It's not enough to know, you have to do what you know. And this book, the third part of what we refer to as our developmental triad, focuses on instincts. Instincts, not like a bird building a nest or a salmon swimming upstream. but instincts as in a genetic predisposition to behave in certain ways when the environment provides opportunities to do that. Because for thousands of generations, there were no governments, there were no schools, there were no religions, there were no institutions. And the burden of raising children and preparing them for adulthood fell on the shoulders of parents. And the question Bob and I asked is, well, how did they do it? Sometimes parents will ask me, well, how was it raising your children? I've raised a bunch of kids when they didn't have iPads to take on the airplane, or they didn't have all of these cable stations to watch. How did you manage to do it? Today, parents can't understand how we did it, but we relied on the inner behaviors that are exhibited by children. The 7 we focused on, because the research is quite powerful, are optimism. Children believe they can do things. We think it's cute. But growing up for our generation of children is a 20 to 30 year process now. And you have to believe that if you set out to do something, you'll be successful. Motivation, having the inner drive. Empathy, being willing to take the time to care about others and support others. Intelligence, and here we talk about simultaneous intelligence, critical thinking. Altruism, giving of yourself. Responsibility, acting in a way in which you accept responsibility regardless of the outcome. And finally, fairness, being fair to yourself and others. And we have put a modifier in front of each. We talk about intuitive optimism or compassionate empathy, in part because it helps define those terms as Bob and I want people to think about them. So it's our description, but also because we think it provides a better understanding. Intrinsic motivation means motivation coming within, not from some contingent reward that you promise the child, which then requires an increasingly greater reward as kids progress through school. And by the time they get to college, they want you to buy them a car and a condominium, or they won't do their schoolwork, right? So we use these descriptions, measured fairness, genuine altruism. And that's what the book is about, helping parents understand the science of these instincts, that children demonstrate them long before we ever try to teach it to them. And the premise here is that children are not tabula rasas, the Latin for blank slates that we have to write upon. Children are not homunculi. They're not little roses that unfold and we have no influence. The fact is that how genes express themselves are greatly influenced by the environment. And one last example, if you never talk to your child, they will never speak. They may have all the genes to speak. They won't do it. If you don't provide opportunities for kids to feel optimistic, to be motivated, to display empathy, to solve problems, to help others, to be responsible, to be fair, if we as parents, and the burden falls on us, if we don't provide those opportunities, whether the child's 6 or 16, those genes, those instincts simply don't express themselves.
Right. So there's a real interplay between what the child already comes disposed to do and how we respond and nurture that. Let's dig into a few of those. And I want to say to our listeners and our viewers, if there's one of those 7 instincts that you heard that you want to hear more about, just pop it in the comments, because we're going to cover as much as we can in the time we have. But we won't be able to cover the whole book. But luckily, you know where to find it afterwards. But let's talk about motivation a little bit, since you started to reference that. And that tends to become an issue more when kids are older. We want to transfer responsibility to the middle school or to the high school, or to take charge of their own schoolwork and to care about it. And for a lot of us parents, it seems like, why doesn't this kid care? I don't want to be trying to make them care about their future, about how they're doing, how they're learning. Where would you start us off, or what would you say to us parents?
Well, first, let me say I don't have a test for caring. So there isn't a test for that. And many parents will come in, specifically you asked about motivation, and many parents will come in and indicate my child's unmotivated. But what they're really saying is my child's unmotivated to do certain activities or to engage in certain tasks, schoolwork, cleaning their room, whatever the case may be. But as you examine more broadly, very clearly the child is motivated and internally motivated. One of the things we see is that young children don't have to be paid to do anything. 2 and 3-year-olds want to help you cook, clean, drive the car. The motivation comes from inside. The payoff for doing it is the pleasure they experience in doing it. And our society is such that we very quickly, our default position when a child, whether they're 8 or 17, doesn't want to engage in a required activity, our default position is a consequence. Sometimes it's an adverse consequence. If you don't do it, I'm going to punish you. Sometimes it's a positive consequence. If you do it, you earn something. But both of those are external. And when you see children struggling, the teens who struggle with depression, the last 7 decades of teenagers have had a higher incidence of depression than the previous decade. 1 out of 4 teens today is at risk to have a major depressive episode sometime during their teen years. And when you look at the data, health data being generated last year since the onset of COVID, the numbers of visits for teens for mental health services has doubled. So it's unclear how that's going to be impacted in a year, in 5 years, or in 50 years in the lives of the current cadre of teenagers. But we're very quick to defer to an external motivation. Why do we do that? Unclear. Maybe we've been taught by our parents. Maybe it seems to be the first thing we think of. I'll give you something or I'll take something away if you don't comply. But the children who struggle the most have the most external consequences, charts and rewards and contracts. And yet the kids who are doing well don't have any of those things.
Can you give
Go ahead.
Can you give us some tools or some practical ideas for what we can say or do instead? Say we have a kid who's not completing their homework, and we want to make sure that happens. What do we do?
Well, homework is an interesting one because it's unclear. One of my books with another co-author was on homework, on the research on homework. It's unclear the benefit of homework. It is clear, however, that because we have less and less time in school and more content to teach children, that by middle school, half of what you learn, you teach yourself. And by high school and college, it's even greater. And now with online learning, children and young adults don't even go into the classroom. They're basically teaching themselves. So homework is an interesting one. My feeling is that homework is the responsibility of the child. And if by teenage years, your child is unmotivated to do homework, it is a challenge because you either step back and say, homework is a contract between you and your teacher. And if you choose to not meet that contract, then there's going to be a consequence for that. Because I'm not going to follow you around the rest of your life, reminding you to make your bed or get to work on time or drive within the speed limit. Homework is about developing responsibility. And parents of younger children feel this pressure from classroom teachers that if the child returns to work with incomplete or homework with errors, that somehow that reflects badly on the parent. And my work with families is early on, I want children to learn to complete homework independently, such that by the time they get to middle school, they've accepted that independence. And so for parents who are struggling with that, I step back and ask, tell me what your child is responsible to do. Sometimes I'll talk to a child or a teen about picking one subject to prove to your parent that you are responsible. Pick a subject you like and prove to your parents that you can keep up with your homework. Now, some children struggle to keep up with homework because they're overwhelmed or they're struggling emotionally or the class they're in is beyond their capabilities. One of the boys I work with just the other day came in quite chagrined because he's got significant reading disability and he's going into 9th grade and his mother made him take advanced placement history and English. This is a boy whose reading level is at a 4th grade level. So there, he's going to have trouble doing his homework, not because he's resistant or unhappy, but he's overwhelmed. And the parent is unfortunately fostering unrealistic expectations. In our book, we do offer parents guides for how to motivate or how to help build motivation early on. And the homework book is called The 7 Steps to Help Children Develop Homework Skills. And we take parents through a manualized, research-proven program. But we do ask questions of parents about their child's capabilities. And I joke sometimes that homework was created by our schools as a way of helping parents and children engage in mutually enjoyable activities.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And that'll be easy to remember since it also has the 7 in the title, to look for the 7 homework book. I wanted to ask about, in the book, you talk a lot about sort of coming sideways at some of the problems. Like the kids' parents will come in and say, we have this problem. And you seem to have this approach where you say, but have you thought about this? Like, for example, one of the examples was an at-risk teen that you were worried about dropping out, and that you got that kid involved in reading to kindergartners. And one of these sideways ways you seem to get at the things that kids are good at seems to be asking them, finding what you call the islands of competence and nurturing those. And it seems to, would you say, have a spillover effect into other parts of their life when we find those things our kids are really good at and encourage them to contribute?
Absolutely, yes. And in longitudinal studies of children who struggle with learning disabilities, for example, those who in adulthood fare the best are not necessarily those who had the most tutoring or special education classes or medications. It's those who find something that fulfills them and make connections to others. That's their identity. If your identity is, I'm not good at anything, it's very difficult to meet the challenges of transition from adolescence into adulthood. And so I've learned in 41 years and seeing tens of thousands of children in this clinic that what's right about you is much more important than what's wrong. And when kids come back to see me with their children, and that happens, I've seen grandchildren of children I first worked with.
Wow.
And in fact, in the book, we start with a story of a boy with autism whom I worked with 37 years ago. And 35 years later came back to see me. I won't tell you the story. And he had an island of competence. And yet he was still struggling to feel fulfilled and be, as it were, be connected to other people and meet the responsibilities of adulthood. So I've learned that what's right about you, again, is much more important. And the kids who grow up that I worked with who really struggled, but as adults were doing well, had found that connection, had found a life partner, had found a vocation they enjoyed, were involved in their community, had mental health stability. And it wasn't predicted by how much treatment they had. In fact, some of the kids I worked with who had great treatments and were doing very well as adolescents struggled to make that transition into adulthood because as those supports were removed, they just couldn't scaffold in the necessary inner supports to succeed. So I spend a lot more time on what's right than on what's wrong, even in our clinic, even with kids who are dealing with chronic, debilitating, sometimes progressive illnesses like multiple sclerosis or Guillain-Barré syndrome, even kids who've had brain injuries, or just kids with developmental problems, learning disabilities, or the common one is kids with self-discipline problems that we've called attention deficit disorder. What we know about all of those populations is that assets are much better predictors of what happens to you than liabilities.
Right. And for parents, it can be hard when our kids, we see what we want from our kids. We see how we want them to fully develop to their best. And we can turn to nagging, and which sounds to our kids like criticism of a lot of times. You're always telling me what's wrong. Any shortcuts or things we can say instead of nagging that will help us to emphasize to our kids that we see their competence, we see what they're good at, and that we're not just seeing what's wrong.
Sure. And a couple of weeks ago, I had a young teen tell me that his teachers didn't like him. And I asked why. And he said, well, they're always correcting me. I suggested that maybe they were just trying to be helpful. And he said, no, you don't understand, Sam. They don't like me. So the mind is an interesting phenomenon. The conclusions we draw, the mind follows no rules of the universe. And sometimes as parents, we're very quick to offer children opinions about how we see their problems through our eyes. Well, just get up out of bed in the morning. Why do you lay there? Well, just come home and do your homework. Why do you fool around and not get started? We think that because of the way we see it, they should see it that way. And so I start with empathy. When a child says, I can't do this, my response is, nobody likes to feel that way. Would you like to try and see if we can figure out why you feel that way or what we could do different about it? We're very quick to draw that line in the sand and place the teen on one side and we and the child's teachers and other adults on the other side, as opposed to staying on the same side of the table. Hey, we're in this with you. As a takeaway message, I would counsel parents, especially with teens, because nowadays there are more teens taking medicines for psychiatric problems, more teens in therapy, more therapy programs, more residential programs, more boarding schools than ever before. So as Dickens wrote, it seems like it's the best of times for our youth, but maybe it's the worst of times. And I counsel parents to not abandon your relationship with your child over school, over curfew, over smoking pot. I'm not suggesting that you condone those activities or you're laissez-faire in how you approach it. No, but I am suggesting that you not place all of your eggs in your relationship in a basket in which the only way you and the child or the teen have a good relationship is if they do what you expect them to do, when they expect you to do it, and how you expect them to do it. Don't abandon your relationship with your kids. I had a teen tell me a couple of months ago that once he turned 18, he was moving out, and it would be a long time before he ever called his mother again. And his mother was, yeah, she did some things that I thought were excessive for this kid for his age. But still, to abandon a lifetime relationship over homework,
Right.
over curfew, over the choice of friends, seems to make little sense.
Well, I think that connection is key, is a good takeaway from one of the great takeaways from your book. And that's probably a great place to leave it. I want to say again that the book is, oh, good, hold it up. Tenacity in Children, Nurturing the 7 Instincts for Lifetime Success. It's available right now. And you can check out Dr. Goldstein's other books as well that he's co-written with Dr. Brooks. And we're so glad that you could join us today. And we hope you'll come back another time.
Thanks for having me. And again, the website is tenacityinchildren.com.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.